This is a guest essay written by Stephen Schechter.
The inhabitants of Sodom were not merely men who enjoyed buggering other men, Marcel Proust notwithstanding. They were men who enjoyed raping other men, especially strangers, and if we read the book of Genesis carefully, we glean they also enjoyed raping women who were also not of the clan. Because the men of Sodom were interested in the strangers sojourning at Lot's door, they refused Lot's offer to take his daughters instead. But as they moved to grab the strangers, the men who were emissaries of the Lord quickly shut the door and struck the men of Sodom blind. The emissaries then told Lot to take his family and flee the town, because God was bent on reducing it to cinders. Lot's sons-in-law scoffed at the notion and tarried, but on the morrow Lot, though himself reluctant, fled with his wife and daughters. Told not to look back, Lot's wife could not refrain and turned at once into a pillar of salt. When Abraham, Lot's uncle, woke up that morning and looked out, he saw the smoke rising from the town of Sodom in the distance. He soon deduced that the Lord had utterly destroyed the city, turning it into a fiery furnace because the sins of the city of Sodom were so great they were beyond forgiveness or redemption. Nothing could cleanse the earth of their evil but outright annihilation. Abraham, in that famous pre-sentence bargaining session with God, had pleaded with the Lord to save the city if he could find 10 just men who lived there. And the Lord, who knew what men could not see, agreed, because of course he knew there were no innocent civilians in Sodom. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is the story of Gaza and the West Bank today. The 3,000 Palestinians who invaded Israel and raped, murdered, and burned men, women, and children because they were Jews, infidels according to the Muslim strictures of holy war, were no better than their biblical precursors. The depravity to which the Palestinians in Gaza descended, ripping babies from raped mothers, burning them in ovens, exulting over the killing of entire families, telephoning home to boast to their parents of their deeds, is indicative of the death culture which Palestinian society has created for the past 100 years. Those who remain skeptical have but to go to Palestinian Media Watch to read about all the gory details of what passes for normal life and child-rearing in Gaza and the parts of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, governed by the Palestinian Authority. When coupled with polls and surveys of Palestinians in these territories and statements by Palestinian political and religious leaders that are nothing short of blood libels of the Jewish people in their country, the conclusion that there are innocent Palestinians living in Gaza deserving of humanitarian aid is a sick joke that only Western idiots can utter. What in fact these latter-day Sodomites deserve is destruction on a par with that suffered by their biblical counterparts, for evil that great can only be eradicated from the face of the earth, as God himself well knew to his chagrin. Translated into contemporary idiom, that means Israel must eradicate Hamas by going into Rafah and conquering Gaza, which it will then rule so that it never again threatens the Jewish state and its citizens. But Western leaders do not get this. Not U.S. President Joe Biden and his Obama entourage of advisors who think what Palestinians deserve is a ceasefire and humanitarian aid. Not Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who is appalled by the killing of babies in Gaza, as if that were deliberate Israeli policy. Not UK Foreign Minister David Cameron, who laments the insufficiency of humanitarian aid to the gangster population of Gaza. Not President Emmanuel Macron of France, who thinks an attack on Rafah would be a war crime. Not the European Union Foreign Minister Joseph Borrell, who thinks the West should hold Israel's feet to the fire for its callous treatment of Palestinians and stop supplying it with weapons. And not the Spanish Prime Minister, who plans to recognize a Palestinian state that does not exist. Indeed, all these Western governments, along with the Portuguese Secretary General of the United Nations, have never held and will never hold the Palestinians to account for their murderous depravity. Instead, they reward them with humanitarian aid and blame Israel for the 100 Years' War that these Sodomite Palestinians have waged against the Jewish state, which only goes to show how depraved the West itself has become in the face of unspeakable evil. So blind are Western leaders to reality that they cannot see that when Israel finally does go into Rafah and the usual gnashing of teeth, wailing over innocent dead Palestinians and Israel bashing gets going, the people who will be responsible for the so-called humanitarian disaster are not the Israelis but the Western governments that have never held Palestinians responsible for anything. But then, Western governments no longer work on the idea that people are responsible for their actions because they no longer cherish their society that previous generations fought wars to defend. Traitors to Israel, whom they claim as an ally, they are also traitors to the countries they head and whose eventual destruction they are preparing. The moral and political inversion which the West, and notably the United States, is now inflicting on Israel shows just how catchy Palestinian depravity is. If the West truly had Israel's back, these countries would be backing Israel to the hilt and demanding the Palestinians hand over the hostages Hamas kidnapped. They would also forbid any pro-Palestinian demonstrations in their cities by invoking martial law to curb the indecent anti-Semitic slurs of genocide leveled against Israel. Such demonstrators should be arrested and thrown in jail. Instead, they are given free license to pollute the great cities of the Western world with their filthy lies, intimidating Western democracies with greater success than they do Israeli democracy, which is one reason, of course, that Western democracies will not stand by Israel, the one country that is willing to wage war if necessary to defend its integrity. The hypocrisy of Western governments, which inflicted so much damage on Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, while retreating in the face of Muslim intimidation in Syria, Pakistan, and Iran, is outstanding. The humanitarian disasters over which they presided because of their moral and intellectual blindness turned the Israeli invasion of Gaza into a Sunday school picnic. But they refuse to see that. They only see Muslim hordes and their sympathizers flooding their streets and chanting their slogans and beat a hasty retreat, wringing their hands over the killing of aid workers who have no business being in Gaza in the first place. And now the U.S. is building a pier to make Israeli military operations in Gaza even more difficult because more than 2,000 dead and 100,000 displaced homeless Israelis are not as important as the deaths of sodomite Palestinians, whose numbers are inflated and distorted by Hamas, which, for that purpose, goes by the name of the Gaza Ministry of Health. All this will only end badly, much worse than what the world has seen through a glass darkly in Gaza. Wait until the war spreads to Lebanon, and then further afield to Iran itself, the biggest state sponsor of terror, which the Biden administration insists on funding. When that happens, the smoke that rises from the ash into which Beirut and Tehran will have turned will remind the West, which is quickly becoming a pillar of salt itself, of the folly of turning its back on the great book that launched their nations on their world historical journey, and on the people who gave them this very gift in the first place.